Welcome to another 10-Minute Thursday Yearbook edition. For this week's video, we're doing grammar and writing tips with my good friend, Jill Chittum. So let's get started. Hey Jill, thanks for joining me today. How's your day going?
It's great so far. It's been a long day of visiting with schools, but I'm happy to be here and talk a little bit about grammar with you.
Awesome. Well, before we get started, this is your first time on the channel, so can you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Jill Chittum, and I am the Walsworth Yearbooks rep in Fort Worth, Texas. And I work with schools all over the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I've been with Walsworth for 8 years now. And prior to coming to Walsworth, I worked as a high school journalism teacher and yearbook advisor at Blue Valley High School in the Kansas City area. And before that, I was a photojournalist. So since I was in high school, yearbook's been what I do, and it's still what I do to this day.
Yeah, and that's pretty much why we brought you on. Like you said, you're a photojournalist, you're a teacher, you're a rep now, so you've been all around writing pretty much the majority of your life, I would say.
Yeah, I would say, I was the person who always tended to write my English essay papers like I was writing a yearbook story, and maybe that wasn't great for my English grades, but it worked out really well for my yearbook career.
Awesome. Well, to kind of get started, I know one of the main things a lot of our schools struggle with across the country really is the understanding of past and present tense. Can you elaborate more on why that is?
Sure. And I'm going to share my screen here and just show you guys a few tips so that you can see what we're talking about as we go. You know, it's funny that I brought up English class because that's always one of the places where I think students struggle when they're talking about trying to learn how to write for yearbook, because when you get into journalism or yearbook class, we basically have to unlearn you of all the rules that you've learned in your classes up to this point. So one of the things that students really struggle with is, say they're writing a story about students' college plans. The story says, Jill planned to attend Harvard University after graduation from high school. It feels weird to say that because Jill's still in high school and she's actively planning to attend Harvard. She hasn't been there yet. The reason that we write those yearbook stories in past tense is yearbooks aren't necessarily for today. Yearbooks are for distribution day, and then all that time that you're going to spend looking at your yearbook 10, 20, 30 years down the road. So the stories are in past tense because 20 years from now, when you're reading your book, those things will have happened in the past. So it seems like, great, we'll just do everything in past tense, right? Yeah, it's never that easy in yearbook. So your stories are going to be in past tense, your headlines are going to be written in present tense, and then to really throw a wrench into the situation, captions are written in both present and past tense. The first sentence of your caption is always written in present tense. And again, when you open up that yearbook in 20 years and you look at that picture, the person in that photo is eternally going to be doing that action. So if you're looking at a photo of a football player running down the field, even 20 years from now, he's still going to be running down that field when you're looking at the book. So that's why that first sentence that describes the action is always in present tense. And then you'll fill in the last two sentences with additional information that's written in past tense.
Those are some great points you hit there. Another big question a lot of our schools ask is how to avoid passive voice in their writing. Can you help on that?
Yeah, let me show you an example. Basically, what active voice means is using active verbs in your writing, trying to avoid the being verbs like is, are, was, were, and am when you're structuring your sentences. So here's an example for you on the screen. You can see Carlos threw the ball. 4 words, short sentence, but it gets the point across. We have the subject, Carlos, and we have threw, which is a strong, version of, it's an active verb. When I say Carlos threw the ball, you can immediately picture what he's doing there. You don't want to say the ball was thrown by Carlos. We've got the subject and the verb and the object all in the wrong order. So you can see there on the screen, Carlos is our subject, the verb is the word threw, the object is the ball. And in our journalistic writing, we want to be as concise and clear as possible. So if I can say something in 4 words versus the 5 or 6 it takes to say the ball was thrown by Carlos, I've done my job of being more concise.
No, yeah, that's an awesome point. And I know that's one thing a lot of my kids struggle with. They'll write these like quotes, but a lot of the information is just filler space. So this, I think, will help them condense that and really come down to that just key information that they would need.
So the next thing that I want to talk about, and it's perfect, you like led me into this with a perfect transition, is how to choose the best parts of quotes that we get for interviews and use those in our stories. One of the things I think students struggle with is they don't do enough in their interviewing to gather lots of good information. So then when they come back, they feel like they have to cram every single word that person said into their story. And I know you guys have already done a 10-minute tips on interviewing, so I won't spend any time talking about that, but I want you to see this example that I've made for you here. So I constructed this example as if I was interviewing Carlos about his quarantine experience, and I have my tape recorder going, and this is exactly what he said after I asked him a question like, so tell me a little bit about what you did with your family during quarantine. Okay, so there's my question. So he says all of this. So that's a lot of great stuff, but I don't need to put all of that as a direct quote in the story. There's some factual information in there, like we didn't leave the house for 95 straight days. That's literally a statement of fact. I don't need to quote Carlos saying that, okay? So as you look at this information, Carlos, what do you think is the best and most interesting that we would want to use as a direct quote?
I think it's that section right after where it says restaurant's butt, where I talk about how I love the time I spent in the kitchen with my mom and sister, learning how to cook.
Yeah, so we obviously want to make sure that a direct quote is exactly what you said during that interview. But I think sometimes students get confused because they think, okay, well, he said all of this. I need to take my first quote mark and put it up at the beginning where the we is. And then I need to put my last quote mark down at the bottom where grandma is, and then put Carlos said at the bottom. That is a whole bunch of information that doesn't need to be used as a direct quote. What we're going to do is pick out some of the factual information and use those facts for transitions into the meaty part of the quote, the really good part. So Carlos gets a gold star because he picked out all the great stuff. Words like, I loved the time I spent, and, you know, this was a really special gift I wouldn't have. That's, you know, he said that in his own words, versus him just saying, my favorite dish I can cook is cheese enchiladas. Again, that's a statement of fact. It's not flowery language. It's not said in some special way that only he would say. So I'll show you on the next slide what this would actually look like in your story. In my story, you can see I've taken that huge chunk of information for my interview and I've broken it into 4 paragraphs. So I started by paraphrasing his statement of fact about being locked down for 95 days. And then we transitioned into his good direct quote. And then there was another statement of fact. His favorite was learning to make enchiladas. And then that allowed me to break up that really long quote and then add in a second quote down there at the bottom to continue on with my story. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes complete sense.
So that leads me into talking about proper attribution of your quotes that you use in stories. The biggest thing to remember when you're out there reporting for a yearbook story is that we are journalists. So it's our job to go out and talk to other people and put their words in our stories. So to me, yearbook stories are really easy to write because all you're doing is taking other people's words and putting them together like a puzzle in the order that makes the most sense. So we always want to make sure that we're telling the reader who said this information so that they have a clear picture of what was happening. If you have a quote that is longer than 1 sentence, you're going to put your attribution in the middle. So you can see there, hybrid schooling fried my brain, Senior Jill Chittum said, and then you use the second part or the second sentence of her quote after her name and said. And I want you to really pay attention to where the quotation marks and the comma and the period are in that attribution. And this is something we practiced all the time in my Journalism 1 class and with my beginning yearbook writers. It just takes practice because it's not something that you're used to.
Sounds good, Jill. That was a great presentation. Is there any other last minute advice you have for teachers or students?
So I always tell this little story about a reporter that I worked with when I worked at the Wichita Eagle. I can still picture him to this day, and this was 15 years ago in my head. He would always print out his stories that he was working on for that day, and then he would pace around the balcony, you know, kind of the outdoor balcony of the newsroom, and read his stories out loud to himself. And it looked kind of silly, but it's genius what he was doing, because anytime you read your writing out loud, you're going to catch little grammar and sentence structure errors that hang you up as a reader. So I took that to heart when I was a teacher. And what we used to do on the day it was deadline to turn in stories is the reporters would put their stories up on our projector screen just with Google Docs. And the reporter would read the story out loud to the rest of the yearbook staff. And anytime we caught a stumble or somebody said, hold on, that doesn't make sense, or I have a question about that, the editor who was sitting at the computer keyboard would type a comment right into the Google Docs for the story, so that when the reporter went back to make their revisions, they had those notes right in there and could access the questions that their students had. So I guess my biggest piece of advice is writing a story for a yearbook is not a one-step process. You know, you've got to go out, do your research, do a great interview, come back, write a draft, have someone else read it, make comments on it, revise, have someone else read it again and make more comments, and then revise it again. You're never finished writing your story. You just end up having a deadline and you have to turn it in and call it good. So make sure that you're really taking advantage of the editing and revising process.
Awesome. Well, Jill, I think we're pretty much out of time, but I think that was a perfect place to end it pretty much. You gave a lot of great tips, and I greatly appreciate that you were able to jump on the channel today and help give advice to our future generation of journalists.
Yeah, this was fun. Thanks for having me. I can't wait to come back and work with you guys again.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely bring you back for another session. And for you guys watching, if there's any other questions you have, something we missed, make sure to put in the comments below. We'll read them, get back to you. And if you have an idea for another video that you want us to do, let us know. Thank you.